It started with a phone call. I almost didn't answer. A man from the Savannah post office said they had a box under my name, unclaimed for 30 years. Mrs. Evelyn Moore, code 512, he said, as if he were reading a verdict. That night, heat pressed against the windows like a heavy palm. The cicadas outside screamed so loud, I could feel the sound in my teeth. I drove down to the post office anyway, barefoot in sandals, hair still wet from the shower. The clerk slid a small brass key across the counter. Been here since '94, he said. Guess it finally found its owner. The box was old steel, the color of old pennies. When I opened it, the smell of paper and time came out. Dry, almost sweet, like burned sugar. Inside were dozens of envelopes sealed with red wax, stacked neatly as if someone had been waiting for me to arrive. Each one was addressed to Evelyn Moore. Born September 14, 1967. But what froze me wasn't the address. Curious, it was the signature. From Evelyn Moore. September 14, 1967. I held the first letter to the light. The handwriting leaned left, sharp, impatient, exactly like mine. My fingers began to tremble. A faint perfume lingered on the paper, something floral and faded, like violets crushed between Bible pages. The wax cracked as I broke the seal. If you're reading this, it means I've died for you. Again. The room tilted. For a second, I thought the words were bleeding. I pressed the page to my chest just to feel something real. Behind me, the fluorescent light hummed louder. My pulse followed it, slow and uneven. The letters looked alive now, curling at the edges like they wanted to speak. I should have left them there, should have walked away. But curiosity is a kind of hunger. I slid the whole bundle into my bag, along with the key, and drove home with the windows down, the night air thick and salt-heavy. Halfway through the bridge, my phone buzzed. A text from my son, Daniel. Mom, I need $25,000 before Friday. Urgent. The words glowed white against the dark screen. I stared at them until the phone dimmed itself to sleep. Then I looked at the pile of letters on the passenger seat, silent and accusing. Both were asking for something I didn't want to give. Money. Memory. Whatever was left of me. When I got home, I laid the letters out across the kitchen table, one by one. Some were thin, others swollen with folded pages. Every seal bore the same mark. A tiny wax key pressed into the red. I ran my thumb over it, the way I used to trace Daniel's name on his baby bracelet. The metal of the key I'd used to open the box was still warm in my palm. I couldn't tell if it was from the Georgia heat or from me. The clock on the wall ticked 11:47 p.m. Outside, the street light flickered. Inside, I heard my own breath, short, uneven. I told myself maybe it was a prank or an old mistake. But deep down, I already knew better. The slant of the handwriting, the way the wax dripped down the edge, those were things you couldn't fake. I opened a second letter. You took my heartbeat the day we were born. I took your name. Balance is all that's left to keep. I pressed my thumb into the words until the ink smudged. My heart pounded so hard it made the paper shake. For years, I'd prided myself on restoring old letters from museums, on saving other people's words from disappearing. Now it felt like someone had restored mine without permission. The kitchen felt smaller by the minute. My reflection in the dark window looked like another woman entirely. Older, paler, frightened. I whispered to her, "Who are you?" She didn't answer. The letters stayed where they were, glowing faintly under the stove light. My phone buzzed again, another message from Daniel. Just 3 words this time. "Mom, please hurry." My throat tightened. I wanted to text back, to tell him I would, that everything would be fine. But my fingers didn't move. They hovered above the screen, then dropped to the wax key instead. There was something cruel about timing. How the past always chose the moment you were weakest to return. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table until dawn, surrounded by envelopes that carried my name and someone else's breath. When the first light crept through the blinds, I knew one thing for certain. Someone out there was living a life that should have been mine. I used to work where history went to die slowly. Inside the State Archive of Savannah, down in the basement where the air was always cold and the lights buzzed like insects. My job title was ink grader, which sounded more important than it was. For $2 an hour, I examined antique letters under magnifying glass, judging how much of the original ink could be restored before the paper gave up. It was meticulous work, the kind that demanded silence. You could hear everything: the scratch of a cotton glove, the slow breathing of old paper, even the pulse in your ear when you bent too close. But I liked it. There was something sacred about touching words someone once bled time into. I kept notes on everything: hours and 10, electricity, 3275, ink pen. Numbers were my way of proving I still existed. Those little entries paid for Daniel's tuition and my mother's heart medicine. When other women wore perfume, I smelled of glue, vinegar, and sunburned paper. I didn't mind. I thought that kind of devotion counted for something. For 20 years, I restored letters for other people. Love notes between soldiers and nurses, wills of dead strangers, diaries of children who never grew up. I knew how to keep secrets that didn't belong to me. I just never imagined I was keeping one of my own. It was a humid Thursday when the envelope from St. Telosa Helena Hospital arrived. Archival restoration request, the note said. It was routine. Maternity records from 1967, damaged by a basement flood. I remember the way the paper felt. Thin but resilient, like skin. As I cleaned off the mildew, a line of text caught my eye. Annie, Evelyn Moore, date of birth, 9/14/67. I froze. The rest of the form listed a social security number I recognized down to the last digit, but the signature at the bottom wasn't mine. It was heavier, almost masculine, slanted forward instead of left. I laughed then, a small nervous laugh that echoed in the empty room. Common name, I told myself. The South is full of Evelyns. Still, I tucked the document aside, away from the others, just to look at it again later. That night, while Daniel slept on the couch with the TV still on, I pulled it back out. I traced the signature under a desk lamp until the ink shimmered. The more I stared, the more it felt like something written by a hand that once learned beside mine. My mother used to tell me stories about the day I was born, that I came into the world blue, silent, a still thing in her arms. You didn't cry for 2 whole minutes, she said. Then suddenly you gasped like you were late for life. She never mentioned a twin, never hinted at any mix-up. But as I looked at that form from St. Chast, Helena, a strange thought slid into my mind. What if someone else gasped the same moment I did? And one of us never stopped breathing. I tried to dismiss it. The human brain will make ghosts out of paperwork if you stare long enough. The next morning, I called the hospital. A tired receptionist picked up. Records department, St. Helena. Hi, I said. I'm an archivist verifying a birth file from 1967. Could you confirm if there were multiple births under the name Evelyn Moore? There was a pause, paper rustling. Then she said, Sorry, those records were sealed decades ago. Experimental cases. Not open to public access. Experimental. The word lodged itself in me like a splinter. That evening, I walked past the hospital's old brick building on my way home. Half of it had been turned into a nursing home, the rest shuttered behind rusted gates. The air smelled of antiseptic and sea salt. Through the cracked window, I saw a flicker of fluorescent light, and for a heartbeat I thought someone was standing there. Same height, same shape as me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't tell anyone about the letter or the record. Daniel wouldn't have cared. He only called when he needed money. Still, I caught myself studying his face during dinner, searching for traces of someone I might not remember. He noticed. What? He said, mouth full of food. Nothing, I answered. You just look like somebody I used to know. He rolled his eyes. That's creepy, Mom. We laughed, but my stomach felt hollow. Weeks turned into months. The file from St. Helena got buried under new projects and unpaid bills. But sometimes, while grading ink under the microscope, I'd see 2 identical lines of writing overlap, the way carbon paper leaves a second, fainter copy, and my hands would shake. The first time I found a letter signed by E, More? That wasn't me. I thought it was coincidence. The second time, I felt watched. I started noticing small things around the house. A postcard from no sender slipped under the door, reading, "Thank you for keeping my place warm." A missed call from an unknown number that repeated the digits of my birthday, 91467, like a code. Each time, I told myself it was just exhaustion. Archivists go a little mad from repetition. You stare at too many dead words, and they start staring back. But deep down, something colder had begun to settle. Then came the letters in the box. The same wax, the same name, the same birth date. Suddenly, everything lined up like the edges of old pages. I went back to the St. T. Helena file that night and ran my finger over the margin. Someone had penciled a note there long ago, half erased, identity retained by donor. Recipient unaware. I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen until morning, listening to the refrigerator hum like a distant machine trying to keep a secret. For years, I'd believed my sacrifices. Every shift, every coin, were building something solid for Daniel. For myself. Now it felt like all that time I'd been paying a debt I didn't know existed. Somewhere, another woman with my name had been living, breathing, maybe even signing checks meant for me. And in the bottom drawer of my desk, still sealed in its envelope, was that original Saint, Helena record. I slid it out and whispered into the dark, "You only borrowed my name once, right?" The silence that answered sounded a lot like breathing. I was 23 when the world still felt small enough to hold in a laundry basket. Back then, I worked in the basement of St. Fien. Helena Hospital, scrubbing uniforms that smelled of bleach and sorrow. The washing machines shook, like restless hearts, and the steam coated my arms until my skin turned raw. Most of the nurses never looked at us, people who kept their white spotless, white. But the head nurse, Mrs. Avery, sometimes lingered by the doorway with a cigarette that never seemed to stay lit. She had a sharp face softened only by pity. "Evelyn," she said one afternoon, as I hauled a sack of linens from the dryer, "you've got the face of someone I buried once. Don't waste it." I laughed, thinking it was one of her morbid jokes. "Well, I'm still breathing, ma'am. That's the thing," she said quietly. Was she at first? I remember the clang of the washing drum stopping mid-cycle, a single shirt sleeve hanging out like a hand reaching for help. I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't ask. Some truths at St. Helena weren't meant for the living. Mrs. Avery kept a drawer of broken things, buttons, rosary beads, bits of ribbon from newborn cribs. She said every piece came from a story the hospital couldn't tell. One night, she handed me a small box wrapped in gauze. Inside was a wax seal stamp, the handle worn smooth from years of use. Its emblem was a tiny key surrounded by laurel leaves. "Clavis memoriae," she said, letting the Latin roll off her tongue. The key of memory. It belonged to a patient who didn't make it. I asked why she was giving it to me. She shrugged. "Maybe it'll remind you that what's lost isn't always gone." At 23, I didn't understand the weight of symbols. I just liked the way the metal stayed warm in my palm, as if it remembered touch. I carried it everywhere. Tucked beside my paycheck stubs, my mother's grocery list, a photo of Daniel as a baby with his fist in his mouth. Sometimes, when I felt invisible beneath the fluorescent hum, I pressed the stamp into a bit of laundry soap just to see the key appear. Proof that I could leave a mark on something, even if it vanished in water. Those were lean years. I lived in a rented room above a bait shop by the river. The air always smelled of rust and salt. At night, I fell asleep to the sound of tugboats and the hospital generator coughing in the distance. I was still young enough to believe that hard work would eventually translate into safety. That if I scrubbed enough uniforms, ironed enough white collars, the world would owe me kindness. But every time I caught my reflection in the laundry's steel doors, I looked older than the day before. The light in that basement was merciless. It showed every crease, every sleepless night, every piece of me that already belonged to someone else. The last night I saw Mrs. Avery, she was packing boxes. The hospital had ordered renovations. The maternity wing was being restructured. She slipped me an envelope before she left. "Keep this," she whispered. You never know when you'll need to remember who you are. Inside was a folded newspaper clipping. Twins stillborn at St. T. Helena, 1967. The date was my birthday. I laughed again. Nervous, dismissive. Coincidence. But Mrs. Avery's eyes were wet when she said, coincidence is just God's handwriting in cursive. Then she was gone, and I never saw her again. Years later, after she passed, I still kept that wax seal key in my drawer. It followed me through every move, every job. Daniel once asked why I never used it. Because it doesn't belong on paper, I told him. It belongs on memory. I didn't know then how true that would become. Now, whenever I hold those red sealed letters, I can almost feel the old key in my hand again, its grooves fitting perfectly against the scars on my fingers. The Latin words come back to me like a whisper through time. Clavis memoriae. The key of memory. I used to think it was a blessing. Now I'm starting to think it was a warning. It was a Tuesday, quiet, humid, the kind of day the air smelt faintly of mildew and old ink. I was alone in the restoration room at the library, trimming the brittle edge of a 1920s love letter, when the phone rang. Calls rarely came directly to my desk. Most people sent emails or left sticky notes by the door. The sound startled me so much that the blade slipped, slicing a neat white scar through the paper. Mrs. Moore? A man's voice asked, crisp and formal. Born September 14, 1967? I hesitated. Yes. Who's speaking? Does anyone else use that date of birth under your name? I laughed a little, though something inside me tightened. My birthday isn't exactly copyrighted, sir. Why? A pause too long. I could hear faint static, maybe the sound of someone breathing through cloth. Then he said quietly, because sometimes, Mrs. Moore, a birthday can come with a sentence attached. Before I could answer, the line went dead. I sat there for a full minute, phone still pressed to my ear. The only sound was the slow tick of the wall clock and the faint hum of the dehumidifier. Then the library lights flickered. Once, twice. The machines never did that before. I shook my head, tried to laugh it off. Probably a prank, I told myself. We got all kinds at the archives. Treasure hunters, conspiracy types, ghost chasers. Still, the words wouldn't leave me. I glanced at my desk calendar. September 14 was circled from years ago, Daniel's reminder for my Big 50. I never erased it. Now the ink seemed darker than the rest, almost fresh. Later that day, I went down to the break room for coffee. A student volunteer named Mara was sorting returned manuscripts. She looked up as I walked in. Weird, she said, frowning. Someone called asking if we kept birth records here. For St. Helena Hospital. 1967. That's an odd year to pick, I said. They said they were looking for the surviving Evelyn. You know what that means? My hand jerked, spilling coffee over the counter. I muttered something about clumsiness and left before she could ask again. Back upstairs, the library felt different, too still, like the air before a storm. I told myself to focus. Paper doesn't lie, people do. And that's why I loved this work. But when I turned the next document over, a slip of paper fell out. A repair request tag I'd never written. On it, in red ink, Return to St. Helena Archive, duplicate file. And beneath it, a faint wax mark. The outline of a key. I stared until my eyes watered. The red was darker than any ink I used. It looked more like blood turned old. That night, walking home, I kept feeling watched. The sidewalks were empty, but every time I passed a dark window, I caught the same shape reflected behind me. Shoulders, hair, a tilt of the head too identical to mistake. When I turned, there was nothing. At the corner near my apartment, I noticed the payphone. The one that hadn't worked in years was swinging gently in the wind, receiver off the hook. The metal mouthpiece clicked faintly, like someone whispering through static. I don't know why I did it, but I lifted it to my ear. Only one sound came through, breathing. Slow, measured, female. I hung up and walked the rest of the way home without looking back. That evening, I found an envelope slid under my apartment door. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid grainy, yellowed with age. A newborn wrapped in cloth, the tag at its ankle barely visible. I held it under the lamp and squinted at the writing. Evelyn Moore, 91467. Then, in a different hand, scratched faintly at the bottom, one of two. My breath caught. I dropped the photo. It landed face down on the floor, like it couldn't bear to look at me either. The next morning, the picture was gone. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it all, the call, the Polaroid, the wax mark. But when I looked down at my work table, I noticed something small and metallic among the stacks of papers. It was a key, no longer than my thumb, the head shaped like a heart. When I held it up to the light, I saw the tiniest engraving on its stem, Clavis Memoriae. The same words from Mrs. Bettis, Avery's gift. The same seal that marked every letter in the box I hadn't yet received. That was the moment I realized whatever was coming for me had already started moving long before the mail ever did. By the time I reached the 7th letter, the air in my apartment had gone still, like the house itself was holding its breath. The stack of red-sealed envelopes had shrunk, but the silence had grown heavier with every crack of wax. The 7th one felt different before I even touched it. The seal was darker, almost black, and the wax carried an imprint that looked faintly burned, as if the stamp had been pressed too hot. I hesitated, fingers hovering above it. When I finally broke the seal, the wax snapped cleanly down the middle. Inside were 2 sheets folded together and a small photograph, faded around the edges. The first sheet was a birth certificate, yellowed, typewritten, the ink bruised by time. St. Helena Hospital, Savannah, GA. September 14, 1967. Infant A, Evelyn Moore. Status, released. Stable. Infant B, Evelyn Grace. Status, was deceased organ donor. My name sat neatly in the released box, printed in the same mechanical font I'd seen on my own documents. But below it, her name was stamped in red ink, the word donor, smudged as though someone had tried to wipe it away. And then the second page, a typed hospital note. Successful transplant recorded. Recipient condition, improved. File closed as per medical directive 67A. I read it again. Then again. The paper trembled in my hands. Successful transplant. Recipient condition, improved. My breath thinned. I pressed my palm to my chest, half expecting to feel something move inside me that wasn't mine. The photograph slipped out and landed face up. It showed a woman standing in front of a pale yellow house, the house I used to rent on Bay Street in 1997. Same porch, same chipped steps. And the woman. She looked like me, not just similar, identical. The tilt of the chin, the birthmark near the collarbone, even the faint scar above the right eyebrow from when I'd fallen as a child. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo, in looping handwriting, "Thank you for giving me this body." My stomach turned cold. I picked up the paper again, scanning every word, searching for any rational thread. But reason didn't fit here. It fell apart in my hands like ash. For years, I'd felt small things. Murmurs in my heartbeat, phantom aches beneath the scar on my chest that doctors could never explain. I'd dismissed them as age, exhaustion, the price of being alive too long. But now I wondered if being alive was exactly the problem. The room swayed. I stumbled back against the counter, knocking over a mug. It shattered, coffee staining the floor like blood. A sharp sound escaped my throat, half gasp, half sob. I pressed my hand against my chest again, hard this time, as though I could reach through skin and find the truth myself. "Who are you?" I whispered, but I wasn't sure who I was asking. The refrigerator clicked on, startling me. Its hum filled the silence, deep and mechanical, almost like a pulse. The photo on the floor caught the light from the window. Her eyes. My eyes seemed to look straight through me. I picked up the birth papers again and noticed faint handwriting in pencil near the bottom margin. It wasn't official, just a scrawl, hurried, emotional. "She lives. He doesn't know." My throat closed up. He? Who was he? A doctor? My father? Someone who arranged all this? I turned the page over, and there, faint but legible, was a date written decades later, 1997, the same year stamped on the photograph. That was the year Daniel turned 7. The year I first collapsed at work, dizzy, breathless, then recovered within hours without explanation. The doctors had called it a minor arrhythmia. Last, maybe it wasn't minor, maybe it wasn't even mine. The phone on the table buzzed suddenly. I flinched so hard the papers nearly tore. It was Daniel again. Daniel, Mom, did you send the money yet? Me, Daniel, not now. Oh, Daniel, you said you would. I need it by tomorrow. Me, you don't understand. Daniel, what's not to understand? Things, Mom, you always have. His voice was sharp, impatient. I wanted to tell him about the letters, about the woman who shared my name, about the photo that proved I wasn't entirely myself. But how do you explain something like that to your child? So I said nothing. The silence stretched. Lit up. Then he sighed. Daniel, you sound weird. Are you okay? Me, I don't know. He hung up before I could explain what that meant. The envelope lay open, the seal split in two like a wound. I gathered the papers and slid them back inside, but my fingers were trembling too hard to fold them neatly. The wax pieces clung to my skin, leaving red smears that looked disturbingly like fingerprints. At the bottom of the envelope, I found a final scrap of paper I hadn't noticed before, smaller than the others, almost hidden in the crease. It contained just one line, typed in uneven ink. No one should live twice, Evelyn. Not unless they died the first time. Something inside me snapped, like a thread pulled too tight finally giving way. I stared at that sentence until the words blurred. Then, I tore it into pieces. But it didn't help. Because the truth wasn't in the paper anymore. It was in me, under my ribs, in the heartbeat that suddenly didn't feel entirely mine. The next morning, I found myself standing outside St. Helena's old brick facade before I even realized where my feet had taken me. The building was long abandoned now. The windows boarded, vines crawling over the faded letters. Through a crack in the door, I could smell the same faint scent I'd known for years. Sterile, metallic, a whisper of bleach. In my pocket, I carried the broken wax seal, the shape of the key still visible in half. I pressed it into my palm until it left an imprint. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if the pulse I felt beneath my skin was beating for me or for someone else still claiming my name. The road to St. Helena was a ribbon of cracked asphalt threading through the marsh. I hadn't driven that way in years, not since the hospital had closed and the land been sold to a private company. The new sign out front read, Helena Gardens Assisted Living. The red bricks were the same, only the windows wore bars now. Inside, the air still smelled of disinfectant and rain. The receptionist, a girl with headphones and pink nails, barely looked up when I asked for the records office. That building's condemned, ma'am, she said. But the old maternity staff still meet here sometimes. Volunteers, you know. If you're looking for someone, you can check the day room. That's where I found her. A woman sitting by the window with sunlight cutting through her hair. Silver, thin, familiar. Her name tag read, Grace Larkin. When she saw me, she stood slowly, studying my face like she was comparing it to a photograph she carried in her mind. You must be Evelyn Moore, she said. I've been waiting for you. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were not. She poured tea with hands that didn't shake. I noticed a small scar on her wrist, the same place I had one, a faint crescent from when I fell off a swing at 8. You look so much like her, Grace murmured. It's eerie. Like who? My mother. Evelyn Grace. The woman who should have lived your life. The room tilted. Excuse me? Grace took out a photograph. The photograph. Oh, yeah. The one from the letter. She placed it between us like evidence. This is her, in front of your old house. She went there in 1997, after her heart began to fail. She said the walls remembered her better than she remembered herself. My hands gripped the table edge. You knew her? I was her daughter, Grace said simply. She died that winter, but before she did, she told me the truth, that she was born the same day as another Evelyn in this very hospital. The two babies were switched. One had a failing heart. Oh, one had a perfect one. The doctors thought they could save both by saving one twice. She paused, searching my face. Who got her heart, Mrs. Gay? More. Her name, her pulse, her chance. My mother lived for 20 years borrowing what was yours. And you. Her gaze hardened. You lived 58 years borrowing what was hers. The sound of the clock filled the silence between us, ticking like a metronome for guilt. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that no one could trade souls like currency, that the past couldn't reach this far. But my throat refused. Instead, I asked quietly, "Why tell me now?" Grace looked down at her cup. Because my mother's death wasn't the end. The files survived. The donors, the transplants, the falsified records. Some of the people involved are still alive, collecting grants, publishing papers on experimental procedures they called miracles. Then expose them, I said. You have proof. She smiled without warmth. That's not what I came for. I came for you to stop digging. I blinked. Stop? You think truth will save you, but it won't. It'll destroy you. The life you think you've built isn't yours to defend. The more you speak, the more they'll make you vanish. So, please return what's left. Her tone softened, almost pitying. Return it in silence. That's the only peace either of you can have. Return it how? I whispered. By disappearing, Mrs. Moore. By letting the name Evelyn fade once and for all. I stood, my legs trembling. You want me to die quietly so your mother can rest. No, she said, meeting my eyes. I want balance. Every borrowed life owes its echo. I left before I could hear more. Outside, the evening sun was low, staining the windows, gold like candlelight behind glass. For a moment, I saw my reflection in the door, two faces layered, mine and hers. I couldn't tell which one belonged to me anymore. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the letters spread out like crime scene evidence. The 7th letter lay open beside a cup of untouched tea. I opened my laptop to check my bank account. The automatic transfers to Daniel were still active. Rent, tuition, insurance. Every month, money left quietly like blood from a vein. I clicked cancel. The confirmation window popped up. Are you sure you want to stop this payment? My hand hovered over the mouse. I whispered, yes. It felt like cutting a cord that had been strangling me for years. Then I opened my journal, the one where I used to write grocery lists and restoration notes, and wrote my first full sentence in weeks. No one has the right to live under someone else's name. Not the doctors. Not Grace. Not even my son. The words looked steadier than I felt. Around midnight, a storm rolled in. The lights flickered, but I didn't move. I stared at the wax seal of the next unopened letter, tracing its shape with my fingertip. The key emblem was deeper this time, pressed hard enough to cut into the paper. I realized the letters weren't just stories, they were instructions. Someone had been leading me to this moment, guiding me to reclaim what was mine, or to surrender it. Grace had told me to disappear, but for the first time, I didn't want to vanish. I wanted to be seen, even if it meant tearing down the lie that had built my whole life. I closed the journal and whispered to the dark. You chose the wrong Evelyn to stay silent. Then I turned off the lamp. The house sank into shadow, but somewhere inside me, something small and fierce began to burn. The first heartbeat that felt entirely my own. The days after that were heavy, muffled, like the air itself was holding something back. Even the light that slipped through the curtains looked unsure, thin as old fabric. Daniel stopped calling. No texts, no short voice notes asking for money, no half-hearted love you, Mom. Just silence. Cold, deliberate silence. Until the post appeared. It was a single line on his social page. Black letters on a white background. Some mothers don't deserve to be born. No name, no tag. But I didn't need one. The words hit like a hand across the face. I read them again. And again. Until the edges of the screen blurred. I almost typed back something. Anything. You don't know what you're saying. I did everything for you, but my fingers wouldn't move. Sometimes silence is the only dignity you can afford. That evening, I walked through the apartment, the one I had lived in for 20 years, listening to the quiet hum of things that didn't care if I existed. The refrigerator, the clock, the street light outside flickering on schedule. The stack of letters still sat on the kitchen table, their wax seals cracked and dulled from touch. The smell of old paper had begun to cling to the air, sweet and sour, like dried flowers left too long in a vase. I took a bottle of clear glue from my drawer and began resealing each one, pressing the flaps gently shut. The glue left a faint shine under the lamp, a fragile mimic of the red wax that once held them closed. Each letter I sealed felt like patching skin over a wound. Temporary, tender, false. I wasn't hiding them. I was preserving them, the way I once preserved the lives of strangers through their words. Now, I was preserving my own undoing. A knock came at the door that night. 3 soft taps. I froze. No one ever visited after dark. I waited, breath shallow. When I finally peered through the peephole, there was no one. Just an envelope on the floor, pale against the wooden boards. No return address, no postage. Only my name, scrawled in a hand that looked unsettlingly familiar. Inside was a single note, typed. "You can't glue time back together, Evelyn." I stared at it until the letters seemed to crawl across the page. Then I tore it into strips and fed it to the sink disposal. The blades ground it to pulp. But the sound stayed with me long after the machine stopped, a metallic growl under my ribs. The next morning I went to the market. People smiled, nodded, the way they always did. But I could feel something shift behind their eyes. Had they read Daniel's post? Had he told them about the money, the secrets, the madness of his mother? Rumors don't need names, they grow just fine on silence. I bought oranges, milk, and a roll of brown tape. When the cashier asked if I needed a receipt, I said no. The less paper I carried, the lighter I felt. That night, thunder rumbled far off, like a warning still deciding whether to arrive. I laid the letters out again, now resealed, and began wrapping them in brown paper. The tape stuck to my fingers, pulling at the skin. As I worked, I whispered to the envelopes, as if to children who'd misbehaved, "You'll keep quiet for now, but when the time comes, you'll speak." The last packet was heavier than the rest. It contained the birth record, the photograph, and Grace's note. I hesitated before sealing it, tracing the faint shape of the wax key embossed on one of the letters. That symbol haunted me now. A key meant access. It also meant doors, some that opened, some that locked forever. Outside, the rain began in small, deliberate drops. Near midnight, I finally sat down with my journal again. I wrote nothing at first, just drew a thin line down the center of the page, dividing it in two. On one side, I wrote, Evelyn Moore. On the other, Evelyn Grace. 2 names, 2 lives, 1 body. The storm outside grew louder, the wind pressing against the windows like it wanted in. I looked at the names again, then closed the book without choosing a side. Somewhere between them, thunder cracked, a deep splitting sound that seemed to come from inside the walls. I looked up. The light flickered. The storm had finally found me. The afternoon they came. The light had that strange yellow tint that makes everything look old, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I was sorting through the letters again, just to reassure myself they were real, when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me enough that one of the envelopes slipped from my hand and slid under the table. When I opened the door, 2 shadows stood against the light. Grace, calm and deliberate as ever, and Daniel, my son, looking thin and tense, the same crease between his brows that his father used to have when he lied. Grace held a folder of documents. Daniel held a brown envelope. Both carried the same quiet intention. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice too steady. "We need to talk." I stepped aside. The smell of rain followed them, in wet pavement, iron, and something else. Inevitability. Grace placed her folder on the table as if it were evidence in a courtroom. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said, "but you left us no choice." "Us?" I asked. My eyes went to Daniel. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He pulled out the papers from his envelope, a property transfer contract, thick with legal stamps and signatures already filled in. It's just a precaution, he said quickly. Grace has contacts at the hospital. They can clear your name from all that confusion. But to do that, you'll need to let me handle your assets for a while. The house, the account, just until things calm down. I stared at him. You mean until I disappear? He flinched. That's not what I said. Grace cut in smoothly, her voice practiced, soothing. Evelyn, you don't understand. The more you dig into those records, the more danger you put yourself in. There are people who don't want this uncovered. You're risking your life. And your son's. Sign the transfer, and we'll make sure you're protected. Protected from what? My own truth? I asked. Oh. Grace smiled faintly. From a truth that was never yours to begin with. Daniel set the pen down on the table, the click echoing like a gavel. Mom, please. I'm trying to help you. You're not well. You're chasing ghosts. I looked at him then. Really looked. The boy I'd once rocked to sleep was gone. The man standing before me saw me not as his mother, but as an obstacle to remove. Is that what she told you? I asked softly. That I'm sick? That I made it up? He didn't answer, but the guilt flickered in his eyes. There and gone like lightning behind glass. Grace unfolded a sheet from her folder and slid it toward me. It was a photocopy of a medical report, stamped with Saint. Helena's insignia. Proof, she said. Your heart transplant, September 1967. The donor listed as infant B, Evelyn Grace. She tapped the page. You've been living on my mother's heartbeat for 58 years. Don't you think it's time to stop pretending it's yours? I felt the floor tilt beneath me, as if the house itself was pulling away. I steadied my hands on the edge of the table. Even if that's true, I said. A heart doesn't make a life. But it gave you one, she replied. For a moment, none of us spoke. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car backfired, startling a bird from the fence. Daniel finally broke the silence. Mom, if you just sign this, we can end all of it. Grace knows people who can make the files disappear. Quietly. No more reporters, no more accusations online. First, tax. I let out a shaky laugh. Quietly? You mean erased? Mom. No, I snapped, sharper than I intended. I've spent my entire life being someone else's version of me. I won't do it again, not for your comfort, not for hers. Grace's jaw tightened. You're being selfish. Selfish? I said. I worked my hands raw to keep that boy alive. I cleaned the letters of dead men while you and your mother played God in a hospital basement. Her face didn't change, but her voice dropped, cold and precise. We gave you a second chance at existence. You should have lived quietly, gratefully. Instead, you've been writing yourself into places you don't belong. I took a step closer, enough to see the tiny pulse at her temple. Maybe I don't belong, but I'm still here. Not for long, she murmured. Daniel shifted uneasily. Grace, maybe we should. No, she cut him off. She needs to understand what she's done. I saw his fingers trembling where he held the contract. He looked from her to me, trapped between loyalties that didn't belong to the same truth. Mom, just sign it, he whispered. Please, it's just a house. I shook my head slowly. No, Daniel, it's not just a house. It's the only place my name still means something. He slammed the pen down. You don't understand. They can ruin me, too. Grace said they'll investigate anyone tied to you. Your accounts, your family, everything. I met his gaze. Then maybe it's time you learn what family really costs. The room went still again. Grace exhaled, the patience in her face cracking. Enough. Either you sign, or we make sure this story never leaves these walls. I looked at her, then at Daniel. My hands stopped shaking. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small black recorder, the kind I used for transcription at the archive. Vowed, I pressed the red button. The tiny light blinked alive. You were saying? I asked quietly. Grace froze. Daniel's eyes widened. Mom, what are you? I held up a hand. Go on, Grace. Tell me again about the switch. About the donor. About the cover-up. Her lips parted, but no sound came. You're bluffing, she hissed. I tilted the recorder. Am I? Outside, through the thin curtains, I saw movement. Mrs. Bowley, Leary from next door watering her plants, pretending not to glance our way. The neighborhood had ears. It always did. Grace followed my gaze and realized it too. Her composure fractured. She gathered her folder quickly. You don't know what you've done. No, I said. But you're about to find out. Daniel stood there, color draining from his face. Mom, what did you do? I protected myself, I said simply. Something you were supposed to do for me. He shook his head, voice rising. You recorded us? You want to ruin my life? Here, I said softly. You did that the moment you tried to sell mine. For a second, I thought he might cry. But instead, he laughed. Bitter. Exhausted. You've lost it. Both of you. He turned to Grace. Let's go. Grace didn't move. She stared at me like a scientist watching a failed experiment. You think truth will save you? He said. It never does. It only eats you alive. Maybe, I said, but at least it'll have my name on it. When they finally left, I followed them to the porch. The street had gone quiet except for the faint murmur of neighbors behind curtains. Grace walked fast, her heels clicking like gunshots on the pavement. Daniel trailed after her, shoulders tight, not once looking back. As they reached the car, she turned. You'll regret this, Evelyn. Every breath you take after today belongs to someone else. I lifted the recorder slightly. Then I'll make sure the world knows whose breath it really was. She hesitated, then slid into the car. I stood there until the sound of the engine faded down the street. The air smelled like rain again. Inside, the papers were still on the table, the pen beside them. I picked it up and clicked it once just to hear the sound. Then I wrote a single line on the back of the contract. Not for sale. The neighbor's blinds twitched. Clock ticked on. Ooh! Somewhere, thunder rolled. I closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and sat at the table in the dark recorder still blinking red, listening to the echo of my own heart beating, loud, defiant, and undeniably mine. It began 3 days after Grace and Daniel walked out of my house. At first, it was little things. A notice from the library saying my contract was under administrative review. A few colleagues stopped replying to emails. The phone calls I used to get from clients wanting restoration work went silent. Then came the news article. Savannah archivist. Under investigation for identity fraud. My name, my photograph, my age all printed under a headline that made my stomach turn. They said I had been using multiple identities to evade taxes, that I'd forged birth records and signatures for money. The article quoted an anonymous family source who claimed I was mentally unstable and obsessed with a false identity. Daniel, it had to be. I sat in the kitchen staring at the screen, feeling the walls tilt. The same hands that once steadied microscopes and antique pages now shook so badly I could barely scroll. By evening, my inbox was flooded. Clients canceled projects. The archive suspended my access. We regret to inform you that your employment is under review due to ongoing legal concerns. Please refrain from entering the facility until further notice. Just like that. 20 years erased. By the end of the week, my mailbox overflowed with letters, none of them kind. Some were anonymous threats. Fraud gets what she deserves. You stole a life. Maybe it's time you gave it back. Others came from people pretending to help fake lawyers, journalists offering to tell my side of the story for a fee. The online comments were worse. I stopped reading them after the first night, but they kept coming. Emails, texts, even voicemail messages whispering accusations. Identity thief. Imposter. Liar. It was like being buried alive under words. I tried calling Daniel, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Once, I left a message anyway. I don't know what she promised you, but she's using you. She's rewriting me in real time, Daniel. Please, before it's too late. He never called back. For days. I barely slept. My heart thudded against my ribs, erratic and foreign. Sometimes I'd wake to the sound of my name being whispered, though the apartment was empty. I started locking the door twice, then 3 times. When I walked outside, I caught neighbors looking away too quickly, their smiles rehearsed. One afternoon, I went to the pharmacy, and the clerk, someone who'd known me for years, handed back my card. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Moore. The system flagged your ID." Flagged for what? Fraud alert. The people behind me in line shuffled their feet, pretending not to listen. I left the basket of groceries there and walked home in the rain, every step heavier than the last. By the time I reached my porch, a small envelope sat wedged between the screen door and the frame. Package, no sender. Inside was a photocopy of the old birth certificate, the same one Grace had shown me. But now the stamp. Donor had been blacked out. Below it, someone had scribbled a message in red ink. "I'll erase or be erased." I dropped it on the floor. My legs gave out, and I sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the refrigerator hum. That night, I opened the box of letters again. My hands trembled as I counted. There should have been 12, but one was missing. The one I'd hidden after the confrontation? Panic spread through me like heat. I tore through drawers, cabinets, every corner of the apartment. Nothing. Then I saw it, tucked behind the radiator, yellowed and dust covered. The final letter. The wax seal was different this time. Not red, but a deep violet, as if the color itself had been bruised. The edges were brittle. The handwriting on the envelope looked faint, uneven, like someone had written it with shaking hands. My throat tightened as I recognized the script. It was hers. Evelyn Grace. I sat at the table, every light off except for the small desk lamp, and broke the seal. The wax cracked under my thumb, releasing the smell of smoke and lavender. The letter inside was short. "If you are still alive, open the seal when the moon is full and bright. 16 nights from now. The truth will shine like ink under light." Below that, a single line scrawled sideways. What they buried was not the body, but the evidence. I read it twice, then again, tracing each word with my finger. 16 nights. That meant the night of the next full moon. I looked out the window. The sky was half dark, the moon, a pale coin behind drifting clouds. My pulse quickened. Was this a warning or an invitation? I folded the letter and slipped it into my journal. The following morning, I received another email from the archive. Termination effective immediately. No severance. No reference. Just a polite paragraph about reputational risk. When I went to clean out my locker, the security guard followed me like I was contagious. My desk had already been cleared. No pens, no notebooks, no photographs. Only one thing remained. The wax seal key that Mrs. Probuse, Avery, had given me years ago, lying in the center of the table. Someone had left it there on purpose. A note beside it read, "Every key fits more than one lock." I pocketed it without thinking, though the metal felt colder than ever. That evening, the phone rang again. "Mrs. Moore?" The voice was male this time, low, deliberate. "You've been busy, stirring up ghosts, dragging the past into the sun. You really should have signed those papers." I didn't answer. "We can still fix this. A confession, a video. Say you lied about the letters, the donor, the hospital. You'll keep your pension. Maybe even your name. Who is this?" A soft chuckle. "Someone who prefers their miracles to stay buried." The line went dead. By now, I knew they were watching. Every time I stepped outside, a white sedan idled near the corner. At night, I could see the red blink of a camera across the street. Someone's phone pointed at my window. Fear turned into something sharper. Curiosity, maybe, or madness. They wanted me quiet, which meant the truth I held was loud enough to matter. The full moon came faster than I expected. The night air was thick with humidity, cicadas screaming like electric wires. I waited until midnight before pulling the violet-sealed letter from my drawer again. I sat by the window where the moonlight spilled in and unfolded it slowly. The paper glowed faintly, as if dusted with silver. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Under the light, faint words began to appear across the page, written in invisible ink. Look beneath the first name. My heartbeat drummed in my ears. I reached for the birth certificate copy on my desk. The one marked Evelyn Moore. I held it under the same moonlight. At first, it looked normal. Then faint letters began to shimmer just below my printed name. Patient ID A67B. Donor program file. I turned the paper over. There, faint but legible, was a location code. Vault 3, St. Helena. A vault. Not a grave. The truth wasn't buried underground. It was locked away. The next morning, I drove back to St. Helena. The building looked even smaller in daylight, the vines now thick across its windows. The gate was padlocked, but the side fence was weak. I slipped through, heart hammering. Inside, the hall smelled of rot and ammonia. Paint peeled like shed skin. The maternity wing had been stripped bare, except for a door at the far end, stamped with fading letters. Vault 3. My hand shook as I pressed the key-shaped seal from my pocket against the lock. To my shock, it fit perfectly into the old brass keyhole. The latch gave way with a soft metallic click. The room inside was small, colder than the rest. File cabinets lined the walls. On one table sat a row of glass jars filled with preserved heart tissue, labels dated 1967. One of them bore a tag that made my breath stop. Owner, Evelyn Grace. The jar was empty, only a note taped inside it. Returned to rightful owner. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. Behind me, the sound of footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate. Grace's voice cut through the dark. You should have stayed away. I turned. Her face was pale in the flashlight's beam, fury tightening every line. They told me you'd come, she said. You can't let things go, can you? I took a step back. Your mother left me this. He wanted me to see. At her head. My mother wanted peace. You turned her death into spectacle. She wanted truth. Truth. Grace laughed, brittle, hollow. You think the world cares about truth? They want clean miracles, not the mess beneath them. She stepped closer. You could have been forgotten quietly. Now you'll be erased loudly. She lunged for the papers in my hand, but I moved first, shoving the recorder from my pocket into her face. The red light blinked alive. Say that again, I whispered. Her eyes widened. From outside, a beam of light swept through the window headlights from a car pulling up. Voices shouted. Footsteps rushed. Grace froze. You called them. Oh, I said. You did. By showing up. She turned toward the door just as the glass shattered. The next moments were chaos, shouts, running feet, someone grabbing Grace by the arms. I caught fragments of words. Trespassing, evidence, press. And then, through the noise, a single voice. Mrs. Moore, are you all right? I nodded, though my hands still shook. The jar labeled Evelyn Grace gleamed under the flashlight like an eye. I reached for it one last time. The glass was cool, smooth, real. If you are still alive, the letter had said, the truth will shine like ink. It had. And now, I realized, so would I. The night after the chaos at St. Elena, I couldn't sleep. The police had taken statements, asked questions I couldn't answer, and left me standing alone in the empty parking lot, still holding the jar labeled Evelyn Grace. When I finally returned home, I locked every door, pulled the curtains tight, and laid out the evidence on the kitchen table. The copied birth record, the violet letter, the recorder still blinking red, and the half-melted pieces of wax I had scraped from one of the earlier envelopes. Something about that wax bothered me. It wasn't brittle like the others. It felt heavier, almost metallic. On impulse, I set one fragment over a candle flame. The wax softened, releasing a thin thread of smoke, and beneath it, hidden in the crust, was a microcassette the size of my thumbnail. For a long time, I just stared at it, afraid to know what it held. Then I dug out my old portable player from the archive days, dusted it off, and pressed play. A heartbeat, and then a woman's voice. Steady, professional, the accent clipped in a way that made my skin prickle with recognition. Patient log, September 14th, 1967. The surviving infant is identified as Evelyn Grace. However, due to complications, the files will record her as Evelyn Moore. The donor infant, listed as deceased, will provide tissue for the cardiac synthetic integration trial. My pulse thundered in my ears. The voice paused, paper rustled. To confirm, Subject A, Moore. Will receive the experimental heart device. Subject B, Grace. To be declared non-viable. Parents will be informed accordingly. Project 67. A. Under supervision of Dr. Larkin. Larkin. Grace's father. The voice continued, lower now, as if aware she was being recorded secretly. They're calling it salvation. I call it theft. The baby who lives will never know the body isn't hers. The other? Well, she'll live on inside the lie. The tape clicked off. I sat motionless, the machine still humming softly. The air felt thick, pressing against my ribs. I rewound and played it again, forcing myself to listen word by word until the truth settled like lead. The surviving infant, identified as Evelyn Grace, files will record her as Evelyn Moore. They had switched us, not metaphorically, literally. The heart pounding inside my chest, its strange rhythm. The coldness I'd always felt in my fingertips, the way doctors could never trace my medical records properly. It wasn't mine. Here it was the prototype, a mechanical experiment housed in human flesh. I was the test case. For years I'd told myself that my exhaustion, the odd buzzing in my ears at night, the faint metallic taste in my mouth were the signs of aging. Now I knew better. I wasn't aging. I was failing. I pressed my palm against my chest, half expecting to hear the whir of gears, to feel the artificial pulse that had kept me alive longer than I should have been. Tears came hot and furious. Not for the doctors, not even for Grace, but for the child who had been rewritten before she could speak her own name. I played the recording again, this time listening to the background. There, a faint clatter of trays, the steady beep of monitors, and somewhere behind the nurse's voice, another woman crying softly. It wasn't random noise, it was a room, a surgical theater. I recognized the echo. Every archivist learns the acoustics of their ghosts. The old maternity wing had tile floors and high ceilings. Sound bounced just like that. It wasn't just confession. It was evidence. I sat back, staring at the recorder, the wax flakes scattered like dried blood on the table. Grace's words came back to me. "You got her heart, Mrs. Gidd. More. Her name, her pulse, her chance." No, she had it wrong. I didn't steal a heart. They built one inside me. I remembered the faint scar over my sternum that I'd always blamed on a childhood accident. My mother had never explained it properly, only said, "You were born fragile." Now I knew why she cried every time I ran too far or coughed too long. She'd known I was borrowed time. The letter's final lines still burned in my mind. "The truth will shine like ink." I turned the cassette over. On the plastic shell, written in faded marker, was a code. A67. B, the same code I'd seen under my name on the certificate. In the lower corner, almost invisible, was a date. Feb 1997. The same year Grace's mother had died. The same year I'd fainted at work and woken in the hospital with no memory of how I got there. Kia. Had they come back then? Repaired me? Tuned up their machine? Yeah, my thoughts spiraled. If they'd built one synthetic heart, there could have been more. Other babies. Other names. Other lives built on silent experiments. And Grace? Had she known all along? Was her truth just another layer of the same design? I opened my laptop, but before I could search anything, the screen flickered, then went black. When it restarted, an unfamiliar message appeared. File 67A, access denied. Unauthorized user. Someone had been watching my connection. Maybe the same people who erased my job, my reputation, my life. I looked at the recorder again, at that tiny machine still holding more truth than any living witness. My fingers hovered over the erase button for a long moment. If they found it, they'd destroy it, and maybe me along with it. But if I destroyed it first, I'd lose the only proof that I was real. I pulled my journal closer and began to write the entire transcript by hand. Every pause, every breath, every quiver in the nurse's voice. When I finished, I tucked the pages inside one of the sealed envelopes, the wax key gleaming faintly under the lamp. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to clarity. Not peace, never peace, but purpose. I understood now why they tried to silence me. It wasn't just about identity theft or hospital records. It was about a secret heart still beating where no one believed it should. And the woman who carried it was done being anyone's experiment. I whispered to the empty room, "You wanted a miracle? You built one, and she's still alive." The recorder clicked off, and in the silence that followed, I could hear it. The faint, uneven rhythm under my ribs, half human, half machine. The heartbeat of someone who was never supposed to exist, still refusing to stop. I'd spent my life bringing other people's words back from the dead, cleaning mildew from paper, tuning the static out of their voices. Now, I was doing it for myself. For 2 days straight, I hardly ate. I pulled the curtains shut, turned my kitchen into a makeshift restoration lab. Every light was dim except for the small desk lamp focused on the cassette. The sound was fractured, filled with hums, echoes, and clicks from old equipment. But that was my language. I'd spent decades rescuing whispers from time. Using my restoration tools, the same software I once used for century-old speeches. I isolated the background noise, lifted the frequencies of the nurse's voice until it was clear and sharp. The surviving infant, Evelyn Grace, switched with Evelyn Moore, artificial heart prototype trial, A67B. Each word was like a nail into the coffin of the life they built for me. I printed the transcript, ran my fingers over the ink as it dried. The texture reminded me of skin, fragile, human, real. Then, I digitized the recording, cleaned it again, and saved multiple copies. One on a drive hidden inside a hollow book. Another uploaded to an encrypted server under an alias I'd created years ago for clients who wanted anonymity. Even archivists keep secrets. By the third night, I was ready. The plan wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. I typed a short message to the Savannah Journal, the oldest newspaper in the city. Small, but stubbornly honest. I have evidence of an unauthorized medical experiment conducted at St. Helena Hospital, 1967. I am one of its survivors. The recording is self-authenticating. Publish it when you confirm its origin. I attached the audio file and scanned images of the letters. Every wax seal, every page that bore my name twice. Then I took a photo of the old mailbox key lying beside them, its brass dull with time. That key had started everything. It would end it too. In the subject line, I wrote, "Truth has a return address." Before hitting send, I printed a physical package. Because digital proof could be deleted, but paper still had a pulse. I slid everything into a thick envelope, sealed it with the wax key emblem, and wrote across the front in black ink, "Truth has a return address." The next morning, I drove to the post office at dawn. The sky was pale, the streets empty. The same clerk from months ago, the man who'd first given me the box key, was on duty. He squinted when he saw me. "Mrs. Moore, you again? Thought you'd moved." I smiled faintly. "Not yet?" When he weighed the envelope, he frowned. "Feels heavy." "It's the past," I said. "It always is." He chuckled, not understanding, and stamped it for express delivery. As the package slid into the outgoing tray, I felt something inside me shift. A click, like a lock giving way. Back home, I began preparing for what would follow. They would come again. Grace, or the people behind her. Maybe the hospital's lawyers. Maybe someone with quieter methods. So I made copies of everything. I labeled them "For Daniel," even though I didn't know if I still had a son to send them to. Then I packed a small suitcase. A change of clothes, my passport, the wax seal, and the first letter that had started it all. The one that said, "If you're reading this, I've died for you again." It didn't feel like running away. It felt like stepping out of someone else's body. That evening, thunder rolled over the marshes again. The air smelled of copper and rain. I sat by the window with the recorder still in my hand. For a moment, I considered smashing it, ending the story before it could consume me, but instead, I pressed play one last time. The nurse's voice filled the room, fragile but unwavering. They'll call it a miracle. Don't believe them. I closed my eyes. I could almost see her. The woman who'd risked everything to speak that truth, sealing it under wax so one day someone like me would hear it. Maybe that was why the letters had survived so long. Maybe the truth had been waiting for someone with steady enough hands to restore it. The next morning, I woke to silence. No calls, no threats, no knocks. For a second, I thought I'd already disappeared. Then, at 9:03 a.m., an email arrived from the editor of the Savannah Journal. We received your materials. The authenticity check confirms the voice matches Nurse Evelyn Avery, employed at St. Sain. Elena, from 1959-1971. We're preparing a feature and a follow-up with legal review. It goes to print Monday. I stared at the words until they blurred. My hands, for once, didn't tremble. That night, I burned the leftover wax from the letters in a small dish. The flame hissed, releasing a faint scent of lavender and smoke, the same perfume that had lingered in the first envelope. The melted wax hardened into a single dark puddle. In the center of it, I pressed the brass key for the last time, leaving its imprint behind before it cooled. A mark, not for them, but for me. Then I whispered into the quiet room, "You built a lie, and called it mercy. I restored it and called it truth." When I finally turned off the lights, I felt the faint hum inside my chest, that strange half-mechanical rhythm that had once haunted me. But it didn't sound foreign anymore. It sounded like a clock winding forward. No longer borrowed time, but mine. And as I fell asleep, the last thing I saw in my mind was the postmark stamped across the envelope leaving town. Truth has a return address. The press conference was supposed to be about medical innovation. At least, that's what the invitation said. In reality, it was a ceremony for the sanitizing of sins. The Savannah Institute of Biomedical Ethics had filled its glass auditorium with polished smiles. Doctors in expensive suits, administrators clutching clipboards, journalists hungry for a headline. Behind them, a large screen glowed with the words, 50 years of miracle medicine. St. Helena's legacy. I sat in the last row, my hair pulled tight, my raincoat buttoned up to the throat. In my bag, the recorder, the original letter, and a printed copy of the transcript now circling online. The Savannah Journal had published the story that morning. Front page, black letters that couldn't be erased. But this wasn't about the paper anymore. This was about faces. Grace stood near the podium, poised, collected, wearing her mother's old brooch. A silver lark. She was there as a representative of the donor's family. The irony made my skin crawl. Daniel sat 2 rows ahead of me, shoulders stiff, tie crooked. He hadn't spoken to me since the story broke, but he'd come anyway, maybe for truth, maybe for damage control. When the moderator called for questions, I stood. "Evelyn Moore," I said, my voice carrying louder than I expected. St. Helena's patient, 1967. Heads turned. Cameras swung. Grace's face drained of color. Her blinked. "Mrs. Moore, this isn't the—" "It's exactly the place," I interrupted. "You're here to celebrate a miracle. I'm the one who paid for it." A murmur rippled through the room. One of the reporters, a young woman from Channel 9, raised her mic. "Mrs. Moore, are you saying the procedure performed on you as an infant was non-consensual?" I laughed, sharp and short. "Can an infant give consent? They called it science. I call it theft." Grace stepped forward, her calm cracking. "She's confused. My mother's research saved." "Stole," I said, cutting her off. "Your mother's research stole lives. Mine, hers, and every other baby in that trial." The moderator tried to interject, but the reporters smelled blood now. Another voice shouted, "Is it true there's a recording? A nurse confessing to the identity swap?" Grace froze. The air changed. I reached into my bag, pulled out the recorder, and placed it on the podium. The small red light blinked alive. The room went silent except for the hiss of old tape. Patient log, September 14, 1967. The nurse's voice filled the hall, measured, weary, undeniable. The surviving infant is identified as Evelyn Grace. However, due to complications, the files will record her as Evelyn Moore. Project 67. A. Under supervision of Dr. Larkin. Gasps, murmurs, the shuffle of reporters' pens. Grace's face went white. Hui. Someone dropped a camera. I kept my eyes on her, steady. Who knew? I said quietly. You grew up with the truth. And you tried to bury it again. She shook her head. But no sound came out. Lockets. A reporter pushed forward. Miss Larkin. Grace, did your mother ever admit to falsifying hospital records? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hands trembled around the microphone. Behind her, the institute's director whispered something to an aide and slipped out the side door. Answer the question, the reporter pressed. Grace's lips parted, but before she could speak, the recording continued. My restoration had included the end that even Grace hadn't known existed. They'll call it a miracle, the nurse's voice said. Can't leave them. The child who lives will carry the machine, not the heart. And when she learns the truth, she'll carry the weight of us all. Then silence. It was deafening. The moderator swallowed hard. I think we should. Don't, I said. Let them hear it. Cameras flashed. Journalists swarmed. Mrs. Moore, do you plan to sue the hospital? Are there other patients like you? Do you forgive the people who did this? I looked straight at the nearest lens. Forgiveness is for the innocent. I'm here for the forgotten. Grace finally found her voice, hoarse, breaking. You don't understand. They were trying to save lives. My mother was told that one child could be sacrificed for another. I snapped. Did she write that in her notes too? She thought you were dying, Grace shouted. They all did. Then maybe they should have let me die as myself instead of living as someone's experiment. The words echoed louder than I meant. For a second, even Grace seemed to crumble under their weight. She looked at me, not as an enemy but as something worse, a reflection. Daniel stood up suddenly, pale, voice trembling. Mom, is it true? His eyes darted between me and Grace. Everything they're saying? Was all of it real? I turned to him. My throat felt dry, my heart, our heart, thudding unsteadily beneath my ribs. You asked me once why I never talked about the past, I said softly. Now you know. Because it wasn't mine to tell. His face twisted in disbelief, then in something else. Grief, maybe. So you really are the victim? I shook my head. No, Daniel. Victims don't get to speak at their own trials. Then what are you? I'm the one who survived. The hall was dead silent. Not even the cameras clicked. Rain began tapping against the skylight above us, soft at first, then heavier, until it roared like applause from another world. The moderator tried to end the session, but the moment had already turned. The story was out. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. Grace sank into her chair, trembling. Her brooch had fallen to the floor. It looked dull now, a piece of tin pretending to be silver. A reporter asked her one last question. Grace, did you know your mother falsified records to save another child's life? Grace opened her mouth, but no sound came. The only noise was the rain and the hum of my recorder still spinning, capturing everything. The institute issued an emergency statement before I even left the building. We are deeply concerned by recent revelations regarding historic procedures conducted at the former St. Helena Hospital. The words were sterile, bloodless, but they were the sound of walls cracking. Outside, the parking lot had turned to mirrors, puddles reflecting the building's pale lights. I stepped into the rain without an umbrella. The water hit my face cold and clean. Daniel followed me out. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said quietly, I didn't believe you. I'm sorry. I looked at him, my son, who'd grown up inside the shadow of my silence. You don't have to be sorry, I said. Just don't forget which name was bought with which lie. He nodded, tears mixing with rain. What will you do now? I smiled faintly. For once, I think I'll live as myself. He hesitated. Will I still get to call you Mom? I touched his cheek. The same cheek I'd kissed 1,000 times before this truth existed. You always did, I said, even when I didn't know who that was. A few photographers had followed us outside. Their flashes reflected off the rain like lightning. One of them shouted, Mrs. Sis! More? Any final statement? I turned toward them, rainwater streaking my face like ink washing off an old page. You wanted a miracle story, I said. Here it is, a woman who was never meant to live long enough to speak, finally speaking. And then I walked away. The next day, the headlines changed. St. Helena cover-up. Exposed. Child identity switch confirmed. Artificial heart trial. Patient speaks out. Truth has a return address, says survivor. Grace resigned from the institute. The government opened an inquiry. And Daniel called me every night, not to ask for money, but to ask how I was feeling. I didn't know how to answer yet. Sometimes, I still woke in the dark, expecting the sound of that mechanical hum under my ribs to fade. But it didn't. It stayed steady, strong, alive. Maybe for the first time, it was really beating for me. A week later, I returned to the spot outside the institute where the press conference had ended. The rain had washed away the footprints, the chaos, the noise. I took the last letter, the one that had started everything, and held it under the drizzle. The ink bled instantly, curling into shapes that looked almost like veins, almost like a heart. For a moment, I could see both names merging on the paper. Evelyn Moore, Evelyn Grace. One bleeding into the other until there was no line dividing them. I don't carry anyone else's heart anymore, I whispered. Them's finally mine. The rain fell harder, smearing the words completely. Somewhere behind me, a church bell rang. A dull, slow toll that sounded less like mourning and more like rebirth. I closed my eyes, let the water run down my face, and felt the beat in my chest sync with the rhythm of the rain. I no longer carry another person's heart, I said softly. For the first time, it beats for me. When the noise faded, what remained was silence. Not peace. Just the absence of everything that used to hurt. I went back to the house on Bay Street, the one with the chipped porch and the rust-colored roof. The city had changed, but that house hadn't. It still leaned slightly to one side, like it was listening for footsteps that never came. Inside, the air smelled of dust and lavender, the scent that had followed me since the first letter. The walls were bare now. I'd taken down every photograph, every frame that carried the wrong version of my life. On the kitchen table sat the letters, stacked neatly, their edges soft from being read too many times. They looked smaller now, harmless, almost like the ghosts had finally run out of breath. I gathered them carefully, one by one, and placed them in the wooden box that once held my restoration tools. The lid creaked when it closed, as if exhaling. Then I took out the last stick of red wax and lit a match. The flame was weak at first, then steady. I let the wax drip over the seam until it sealed the box shut, a thin red line across wood, like a healed scar. When the wax cooled, I pressed the brass key stamp into it for the final time. The impression was perfect. Underneath, I wrote in black ink, "To the woman who was me." I paused, the pen still in my hand. The words looked both like farewell and forgiveness. Outside, the afternoon light filtered through the magnolia trees. I walked to the old post office, the same one where everything had begun. The clerk, the one with the pink nails and the bored eyes, was gone. A new boy sat behind the counter, barely out of college. He looked up when I entered. "Can I help you, ma'am?" I placed the box on the counter. "Yes," I said. "It's a return delivery." He turned it over, frowning at the address written across the top. Evelyn Moore, heaven knows. "Who's that? A real place?" he asked, half smiling. I smiled back, tired but light. "If it isn't, it will find one." He shrugged and stamped it anyway. "We'll do our best." I watched as he carried the box to the outgoing shelf, stacking it between parcels bound for places with real zip codes. As it disappeared behind the counter, a strange calm settled in me. Not joy, not closure, but something quieter. Relief, maybe. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the low hum of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog. I looked up at the moon, almost full, like the night the truth first revealed itself. Its light fell softly across my hands, across the scar on my chest that I'd stopped hiding. For the first time, I didn't see it as a mark of shame. It was proof that I had survived both science and silence. I whispered into the dark, not sure to whom. I kept your letters safe. I carried your heart as far as it would go. Now it's time to give it back. The wind moved through the trees, gentle, approving. In the following days, the world went on pretending it knew what to do with truth. The Institute made apologies wrapped in legal language. Reporters moved on to newer scandals. And Grace, she vanished, leaving only an unsigned note slipped under my door. You were never meant to find her. But maybe she meant to find you. I burned it without reading further. Daniel came by once, bringing groceries and an awkward silence. He didn't ask about the case or the past, he just fixed the squeaky hinge on the door and stayed for dinner. When he left, he hugged me tighter than he had in years. You seem lighter, he said. I mailed the weight away, I told him. He laughed softly, not quite understanding, and kissed my forehead. In the days that followed, I began to move differently. I stopped flinching when the phone rang. I stopped waiting for the past to knock. I even found myself humming sometimes. Tuneless, small, but mine. The doctors had told me once that the human heart leaves a faint electrical signature unique to its owner. If that was true, then whatever beats inside me now, metal, flesh, or memory, has rewritten its code. I pressed my hand against my chest and felt it again. Not the mechanical rhythm of survival, but the quiet thrum of existence. Before bed, I checked the tracking receipt from the post office out of habit. Was no update. Just one simple note on the screen. Status delivered. No location. No signature. Just delivered. I stared at the word for a long time, then closed the laptop. Somewhere far away, maybe in a forgotten mailroom or in a place the world has no address for, a wooden box waits. Sealed in red wax, carrying the story of two women who shared one heartbeat too long. And for the first time in half a century, both of us are finally at rest. When I turned off the lights, the house hummed softly. The refrigerator, the pipes, the faint echo of rain outside. I whispered one last time to the dark, "Sleep well, Evelyn Grace. Lee, you were never just the donor. You were the proof." Then I lay down, closed my eyes and listened. Not for silence, but for the sound of my heart beating, slow and steady, no longer borrowed, completely, quietly, mine. A year can pass quietly when you've already lived half a lifetime inside a storm. It didn't rush, it didn't crawl. It simply was. Like breath after drowning, the kind that hurts but means you're still alive. 1 year since the press conference. 1 year since I sealed the last letter and mailed it back to nowhere. 1 year since I decided to live as a woman whose name no longer belonged to anyone else. Now, when people ask what I do, I tell them, I teach women to write their lives back into their own hands. I call it Ink Echo Studio. A small workshop on the corner of Telfair Street, with wide windows that face the river and light that always finds its way in, even on gray days. The space smells of ink and paper and something warm, maybe courage, maybe freedom. Every Tuesday, a dozen women gather around the long oak table. Widows, single mothers, nurses, secretaries, all with stories they've been told to keep quiet. They come with trembling hands, afraid their words aren't worth the paper. And every week, we prove otherwise. On the far wall hangs a glass case. Inside, the old mailbox, the one that started it all, now shines gold. It's no longer rusted or dented. The brass has been polished until it glows like a relic from another world. Below it, engraved on a small plate, are the words, "Returned," and "Finally received." Visitors often ask if it's real. I tell them, yes, and so are the ghosts inside it. Sometimes, when the studio is quiet, I swear I can still hear the faint clink of keys and the whisper of envelopes sliding against one another, as if they're relieved to rest at last. One morning, during class, a student named Miriam, a retired nurse with kind eyes and a laugh that cracked like paper, raised her hand mid-lesson. She had been struggling with her assignment. Write a letter to the woman you used to be. "Coo, Evelyn," she said, tilting her head. "Are you ever afraid to open mail now?" You. The room went still. Even the pen stopped scratching. I smiled, setting my own pen down. "No," I said softly. "Not anymore." She frowned, curious. "Why not?" I looked at the wall where the golden box gleamed in the morning light. Because I realized the only letters that ever scared me were the ones I never dared to send. The women around the table nodded, some smiling, some fighting tears. After class, I stayed behind, as I often did. I straightened the papers, collected the ink-stained napkins, and watered the small plant by the window, a heartleaf philodendron, a gift from Daniel. He'd started visiting more often, always unannounced, carrying coffee or groceries or just silence. We never spoke of the past directly, but every gesture was an apology. He'd found work restoring antique furniture, learning to make old wood shine again. Maybe it runs in the blood, this urge to mend what time tries to erase. Sometimes he helped me organize letters from my students, sorting them into boxes labeled healing, anger, hope. He'd laugh at the last one. "You sure people still write hope?" I'd answer. "Every day." At night, when the studio emptied and the streets outside softened into quiet, I'd sit at the big oak table with my own stack of blank paper. I no longer wrote to Evelyn Grace. That conversation had already found its ending. Now I wrote to the women who came to me, letters of encouragement, of gratitude, of witness. Sometimes, though, I still felt that old pulse in my chest, the metallic rhythm that once haunted me. It was slower now, calmer, but it reminded me that even miracles built on lies can choose honesty in the end. Once, a journalist reached out asking to interview me for an anniversary article. She wanted the inside story of the Saint Say, Helena case, how it felt to discover you were the heart of a medical scandal. I declined, because that's not what I am anymore. I'm not a scandal. I'm a survivor who became a storyteller, and that's enough. Still, I mailed her a short note anyway. "The experiment succeeded," I wrote. "The machine learned to feel." On the studio's first anniversary, my students surprised me. They pooled their savings to buy a sign for the front door. Ink. Echo Studio. Words that breathe. When they unveiled it, I felt my throat tighten. One of them said, "You gave us our voices back." I shook my head. "You always had them." I just turned down the noise. We celebrated with cake and ink-stained fingers. Miriam handed me an envelope, white, simple, sealed with gold wax. "Open it," she urged. Inside was a card filled with signatures, but at the top, they'd written a single sentence. "To the woman who taught us we could return to ourselves." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I thought of the letters that once bound me to a lie, and how now, letters had set me free. Later that night, when everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the studio. The city outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. I looked up at the golden mailbox and thought of how far it had traveled, from the rusted post office drawer to this wall of light. Once, it had held my undoing. Now it held my proof of life. I poured myself a glass of wine, lit a candle, and whispered to the box like an old friend. "We made it, didn't we?" The wax glowed faintly in reply. I sometimes imagine that somewhere, beyond whatever heaven exists for those who never got to live, Evelyn Grace is watching. Maybe she laughs when she sees what I've done with the life we shared. Maybe she shakes her head saying, "You always did write too much." If she could hear me now, I'd tell her this. They called it an experiment, but it was really a beginning. And though they built our heart to be mechanical, it learned to beat on its own. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the studio walls amber, I sat by the window writing the last line of a new letter to my next class. If you ever find yourself afraid of opening what's meant for you, remember this. Letters, like people, are only dangerous when left unread. I signed it simply, Evelyn Moore. For the first time in my life, the name didn't feel borrowed. It felt like an inheritance, restored, renewed, and rightfully mine. When I left that night, I turned off the lights and glanced back through the window. The golden mailbox shimmered softly under the street lamp, as if it knew it had one last delivery to make, to memory, to peace, to whatever comes next. And somewhere deep inside me, the heart that once belonged to another woman kept beating steady, quiet, certain. It wasn't echoing anymore. It was singing. The following morning, as I unlocked the studio door, a breeze slipped in and scattered a few blank sheets across the floor. They fluttered toward the wall, landing just beneath the golden box. When I bent down to gather them, I noticed something new. A faint line of dust shaped like a fingerprint on the glass, not mine. It made me smile. "Good morning, Grace," I whispered. Message received. Then I picked up the papers, smoothed them flat, and began again. Because that's what we do here. We write. We restore. We return. And as the first student walked in, I said the same words I always begin class with. No one writes your story but you. The women nodded, pens poised, eyes bright. Outside, the river kept moving, carrying reflections of clouds that never stayed the same. Inside, the air smelled of ink and new beginnings. When Miriam, always the first to finish her assignments, looked up and asked with a smile, "Miss Evelyn, are you still afraid of getting letters?" I laughed softly, the sound warm and sure. "No," I said, "now I'm only afraid of never sending them." And as laughter filled the room, the golden mailbox gleamed brighter, as if it, too, was finally at peace. Returned, and finally received. The camera light blinked red. Recording. I sat in front of it, the same way I used to sit before a blank page. Nervous, deliberate, but ready. Behind me, the golden mailbox gleamed softly under the studio light. The letters from my students hung on the wall like constellations, every one of them proof that stories could still find their senders. I looked straight into the lens. My reflection stared back, calm, unflinching. "If one day," I began, my voice steady, "you receive a letter from someone who shares your birthday, don't throw it away." The words lingered in the quiet. Maybe it isn't a warning from the past. Maybe it's an invitation, a chance to live truthfully, finally, under your own name. I paused, letting that truth breathe. For years, I'd hidden behind borrowed names, borrowed stories, borrowed silence. Now, even my pauses belonged to me. I thought of all the women who had written to me after the story went public, messages from strangers in every corner of the world. I was adopted, and I've never known who I really am. My husband took everything, even my name, but I'm starting over. Your story made me remember the girl I used to be. Each one was a heartbeat. Each one reminded me that survival isn't about what we inherit, it's about what we reclaim. I leaned closer to the camera. If you're holding on to a secret, a lie, or a version of yourself that doesn't fit anymore, write it down. Send it somewhere. Even if it's just to yourself. Because silence may protect others, but it never saves you. On the table beside me lay an envelope. Blank, untouched. I picked it up and held it to the camera. "This is what freedom looks like," I said. "Empty space waiting for your handwriting." I slid a piece of paper inside and sealed it. No name, no address, just one line on the front, "To whoever I truly am." Then I smiled. Not the polite, camera-ready kind, but the small, private smile of someone who's finally stopped hiding. "Share this story," I said softly. Not for me. For the people out there still afraid to open their own letters. Because maybe, somewhere, someone's reading a message meant for them all along, and they just need a little courage to reply. The red light on the camera blinked again, the signal that the recording was ending, but I wasn't done. I placed my hand flat on the table, over the sealed envelope, and whispered the last words not just to the audience, but to myself. My story closes here. But maybe, just maybe, this is the first letter I've ever signed with my real name. The camera clicked off. Silence followed. And in that silence, I could hear it again. Faint but certain. The sound of a heart that no longer borrowed its beat, writing its own signature in every pulse. Top of form. Bottom of form.